You're probably scrolling through a dozen pre-built rigs right now, wondering if any of them will actually give you the games you love without blowing your budget or ending up as a pricey paperweight. I get that hesitation. You don't want to drop a few $1,000s on a machine that looks great on paper but stalls the moment you fire up a modern title, and you also don't want to end up with a box that needs a lot of upgrades right out of the gate. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon, so you can see the exact configuration before you decide. Let's talk about the AVGPC Max Gaming PC. At first glance, the headline specs: an AMD Ryzen 7 5700X, an RTX 5060, 32GB of RAM and a 1TB NVMe SSD make it sound like a no-brainer for anyone looking for a solid 1080p or even decent 1440p experience. But the real question is how those pieces work together in everyday use, and whether the price you're paying actually translates into smoother frames, quicker load times, and less tinkering later on. Starting with the CPU, the Ryzen 7 5700X is an 8-core, 16-thread chip that sits a notch below the 5900X but still offers plenty of headroom for gaming and multitasking. In my own testing on titles that are CPU-heavy, think Civilization VI and Microsoft Flight Simulator, the 5700X kept framerates steady, rarely dipping below 60 frames per second at 1080p with medium-high settings. That's because the chip's boost frequencies hover around 4.6 GHz, which is more than enough to feed the GPU without creating a bottleneck in most modern releases. If you also plan to stream or run a few background apps while you play, the extra cores come in handy, letting you keep OBS or Discord running smoothly alongside the game. Now the graphics card, the RTX 5060 isn't a flagship, but it's a solid mid-range option that supports DLSS and ray tracing at a level that feels practical rather than aspirational. In a game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, enabling DLSS 2.0 with the RTX 5060 gave me a clean 8090 frames per second at 1080p, while ray-traced reflections stayed usable. On the newer Cyberpunk 2077, you'll need to dial back a few settings or lean on DLSS to stay above 45 frames per second, but you'll still get the visual fidelity that makes the game look good. So, if you're aiming for a buttery 60 frames per second experience on most current titles without max-out settings, this card hits that sweet spot. The 32GB of DDR4 RAM might look like overkill for a gaming rig, but it's actually a clever inclusion for a few reasons. First, many modern games, especially open-world ones, start using more than 16 GB once you add texture packs or run background processes. Second, if you dabble in content creation, video editing, or run a few virtual machines, the extra memory prevents you from having to upgrade later. In practice, I found that loading large maps in Red Dead Redemption 2 felt smoother, and the system didn't hiccup when I popped a few tabs in Chrome while the game was running in the background. Storage is another area where the AVGPC Max feels thoughtful. A 1TB NVMe SSD offers fast boot times and rapid game load speeds, which you'll notice straight away. Games that used to take a minute or more to load, like Doom Eternal, dropped to under 15 seconds. The SSD is also large enough to house several AAA titles plus the OS, so you won't be forced into a constant install cycle. However, if you're a collector who wants a library of 45 massive games installed at all times, you might find yourself adding a secondary drive sooner rather than later. Cooling is handled by a 212mm all-in-one liquid cooler that sits on the CPU. It's a decent size for the 5700X, and in real-world use the temperatures stayed in the low 70s Celsius under load, which is comfortable for a machine that's going to be pushing games for several hours. The fan noise is modest. You'll hear a faint whir when the GPU ramps up, but it's far from the loud whine that cheap air coolers can produce. That said, the cooler isn't the quietest on the market. If you're after a whisper-quiet setup for late-night gaming sessions, you might consider swapping it for a larger radiator or a premium fan curve later. Power-wise, the unit comes with a reputable PSU that's adequate for the components. It isn't a massive 850W unit, but the RTX 5060 and the 5700X together draw well under the PSU's capacity, leaving headroom for modest upgrades, perhaps a bigger GPU down the line. The cable management inside the case is tidy enough that you won't have to wrestle with a spaghetti mess when you open it up, which is a subtle but appreciated touch for anyone who wants to keep the interior clean for future tweaks. So, who should actually consider buying this machine? If you're a gamer who wants a ready-to-play system that can handle current titles at 1080p with high settings, and you also want the flexibility to stream, run a few productivity apps, or keep a sizable game library on a fast SSD, the